Hi students and family members, and welcome to Mr. Panza's math videos on how we can compare fractions accurately. Let's take a look at our focus question a little bit more detailed. How do we compare fractions with unlike denominators? In other words, we're looking for, is this fraction over here greater than, less than, or equal to this fraction over here? And yes, I do encourage all of my students that when they are creating these fraction mouths, to actually make little designs out of them so that they remember this alligator is hangry. He's hungry and angry, and he will always eat the larger fraction every single time. So create little alligators that show the mouth eating the biggest fraction. Now let's get into the specifics of how you can solve for this question. A question like 1/2 or 3/7 is 1/2 greater than, less than, or equal to 3/7 is a difficult question. And there are a couple of different ways that you can attack this question. So let's take a look at the steps that I've compiled to make sure that you can answer this question accurately every single time. Check for common denominators. Well, in this problem, 2 is the denominator in the first fraction, and 7 is the denominator in the second fraction. So we do not have common denominators, which means we do not skip to step 5. Instead, we have to do steps 2, 3, 4, and then 5. Step 2 and 3 are very similar. We need to list multiples of the first denominator, which is the number 2. And step 3 is list multiples of the second denominator. You can simply do that by skip counting, or remember my music. Multiples means music. While there is no music or skip counting song for 2, most 4th grade students are able to skip count by 2 independently because they know 2, then 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. I've skip counted by 2 up to 16. I've listed the multiples of 2 just by skip counting by 2. I can do the same exact step by skip counting by 7. This one I do have a song for. 7, 14, 21, 28. However, as soon as I have reached a multiple that matches, in other words, a multiple that is the same exact number when I skip count by 7, that also comes up when I skip count by 2, I can stop. In other words, when I skip count by 2, I eventually get to 14. When I skip count by 7, I also get to 14. Now that I know that 14 is a common multiple of both 2 and 7, I can create what are called equivalent fractions. That is step 4. Let me show you step 4 over here. Poof, here's my 1/2 and here's my 3/7. In order to create an equivalent fraction, which was addressed in a previous lesson here on my website, you need to find common denominators. We've done that, understanding that 2 can be changed into 14 and 7 can be changed into 14. In order to find an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 14, you need to understand how we went from 2 to 7. And typically, changing denominators means you multiply or divide. In this case, we multiplied this number by 7. So if I wanted to make an equivalent fraction out of 1/2, and I changed the bottom or the denominator using multiply or divide, the same must be applied to the numerator. So if I multiplied the denominator by 7, I must multiply the numerator by 7, which means 1 times 7 equals 7. So an equivalent fraction for 1/2 is 7/14. The same can be said for 3/7. In order to change the denominator, I needed to multiply by 2. So if I change the denominator using multiply or divide, the same to the top numerator must be applied. So if I multiplied the denominator, which was 7 by 2 to get 14, I need to multiply the numerator, which is 3 by 2, which gives me the answer of 6. And now that I have created 2 equivalent fractions with common denominators, I'm finally ready for step 5. Compare the numerators and then the mouth open wide towards the larger numerator. Let's take a look at what that looks like. On this page, you can see visual representations of finding an equivalent fraction for 1/2 and 3/7 in order to get 7/14 and 6/14. You can also see the steps that I took over here on the left to create the same exact fractions, listing the multiples, then creating an equivalent fraction of 1/2, which was 7/14, and another equivalent fraction to 3/7, which was 6/14. And now I'm ready for step 5. Step 5 can be seen over here. Compare the numerators, and the mouth of the alligator will open wide towards the larger numerator. Well, in this case, it should be pretty evident to see that 7, which is in the numerator of 7/14, is larger than the 6, the numerator in 6/14. So my alligator mouth must open wide towards the 7. And again, feel free to draw a little alligator design to make it stand out a little bit more so that you can hopefully see and understand that this alligator is going to eat 7/14. In other words, my largest fraction is not just 7/14, it's also 1/2 when compared to 3/7. So you can use equivalent fractions to solve fractions that have unlike denominators. You have a couple of practice sheets that you can download here on Mr. Panza's website, and if you'd like to, you can pull those up now and do the first couple with me. Over the next few minutes, I plan on taking you through these steps to create equivalent fractions and compare fractions. Take those sheets out now. I've listed the steps to creating equivalent fractions for comparison of fractions with uncommon denominators here on the left. I'm going to provide all of my work over here on the right-hand side, and then I will place my answers where you see the worksheets that you downloaded from my page. So for example, we have 1/4 compared to 1/8. In order to follow the steps, we first check for common denominators, which there are none. Now I need to list multiples of 4 and 8 to find a common multiple. 4, 8, 12. Well, I don't need to go very far because the second multiple of 4 is 8, which matches 8, which is also a multiple of 8. So now I can create two equivalent fractions. 1/4 needs to equal something with an 8 in the denominator. Well, how did I go from 4 to 8? I changed the denominator using multiply or divide. In this case, I multiplied by 2, which means the same to the top must be applied. So 1 times 2 will get me 2. My new fraction, instead of 1/4, to use to compare to 1/8 is 2/8 because I created an equivalent fraction. I can now take a look at the original 1/8 fraction and compare because step 5 tells me after I've created an equivalent fraction based on the number as showing the common denominator, I can compare the numerators and open my mouth towards the largest numerator, which in this case is 2/8, which, if I go all the way back to the original fraction, is 1/4. 1/4 is greater than 1/8. Let's take a look at one more example on this page. The one directly below is 1/12 and 4/12. I again have to notice that 12 is not a common denominator with 4. So the first thing I must do is list the multiples of the first denominator, which would be 4. And I can use that by using my multiple songs, 4, 8, 12. And I can stop there because my second denominator's first multiple is 12, which means in my fraction 1/4, I need to come up with a common denominator, which is 12. And how did I do that? I changed this denominator by using multiply or divide. In this case, I multiplied by 3. And the same to the top must be applied. So I multiply 1 times 3 and I get 3. Now I'm ready to compare 3/12 to the original first fraction of 1/12. In this case, I'm ready for step 5 because step 5 tells me once I have equivalent fractions, I'm good to compare the numerators and see which number is actually larger. So as I look, is 3/12 larger than 1/12? It certainly is, which then also tells me that 1/4 is larger than 1/12. 1/4 is larger than 1/12. Let's do one more example. Let's take a look at the third one on the page that shows me 3/6 compared to 4/8. I do not have common denominators, which means I need to list the multiples of the first denominator. In this case, my first denominator is 6. Let's sing the song. 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36. Then I'm ready to list the first few multiples of 8. 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48. Then I've got to find the common multiple that first matches, which in this case would be 24 and 24. So the first fraction was 3/6. I need to change 3/6 to an equivalent fraction that has a denominator of 24. And that's because 24 is the least common multiple, which equals my equivalent denominator in this problem. How did I change this 6 to a 24? I changed the denominator using multiply or divide. In this case, 6, 12, 18, 24 was 6 times 4. And the same to the top must be applied. 3 times 4 gets me 12. And I do the same exact thing with the second fraction. 4/8 can be listed as an equivalent fraction by changing the denominator. Again, I changed the denominator to 24, and how did I do that? I multiplied, changed the denominator using multiply or divide. In this case, I multiplied by 3, and the same to the top must be applied. And 4 times 3 is 12. And then when I put these two fractions next to each other, I can actually see that I have equivalent fractions, which means 3/6 is actually equivalent to 4/8. And that, again, is how you compare fractions with unlike denominators using all of the steps we showed you here on the left-hand side. Check for common denominators, then list the multiples of the second fraction, create equivalent fractions, and compare the numerators. I know it's a long, drawn-out process, but if you can do it this way, it means not only are you going to be able to compare fractions, it means that you also understand fractions a little bit deeper than just knowing a strategy. Thanks. Hope this video helps.